My son-in-law called me on a Tuesday evening to let me know I wouldn't be attending my daughter's 10th anniversary celebration. He was polished about it. He always was polished about things that hurt. He said they were keeping the guest list focus. Really more of a close friends and immediate family kind of evening, he explained, which would have landed better if I hadn't already heard from my daughter's college roommate that she'd received her invitation 4 days prior. 63 people on the guest list. 63. Her father wasn't one of them. I told him I understood completely. I wished them a wonderful evening. I thanked him for the courtesy of calling. Then I sat at the kitchen table, where I'd watched my daughter do homework for 12 years. And I thought about what Brian didn't know. He didn't know about Crestwood Hollow Vineyard. He didn't know that the venue where he'd booked their anniversary dinner, Harmon's at the Ridge outside Charlottesville, 3 consecutive awards from Virginia Living magazine, sourced every bottle they poured from 3 local Virginia wineries, and that one of those 3 had been mine for 11 years. By the time Laura walked through those doors expecting the evening of her life, I was already inside. Not at a table in the back, not at the bar. Standing in the private dining room with the venue's wine director, reviewing the evening's pour schedule. That was 3 weeks ago. Before we go any further, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting us know where you're listening from. This is the full story. Joan died in October of 2016, breast cancer. 17 months between the diagnosis and the morning I sat beside her hospital bed, holding a hand that had gone still. Laura was 29 then, and flew home from Richmond every month during the treatment. For that year and a half, the 3 of us were closer than we'd been since she was small. Waiting room sandwiches from the vending machine. Trading shifts so Joan was never alone. Laughing at bad television in the room because laughing felt better than the alternative. That closeness was real, and I believed in it without reservation. Then Joan was gone, and grief sorted us differently. Laura went back to her life. She went back to Brian, who she'd married 2 years before the diagnosis in a ceremony I'd spent $41,000 on, and 2 months helping organize. I'd written that check without a second thought. That was what fathers did. The Sunday calls ran faithfully for the first year, then every other Sunday, then whenever she thought of it. I didn't push. I told myself she was managing her own grief on her own schedule, and she needed space, and I was glad to give it. What I was actually doing was accommodating a distance that was only going to grow. Brian had been polite to me from the beginning, in the specific way that privately dismissive people are polite to those beneath their consideration. He did his job well. Business development for a commercial real estate firm in Richmond, good salary, a social fluency that read his confidence until you noticed it only activated around certain people. At family dinners he sat angled toward his parents, Carl and Wanda, and Laura matched his orientation the way she'd learned to over 10 years of marriage. The 3 of them formed a closed loop. I sat outside it and convinced myself I was imagining things. I stopped imagining things when my daughter's college roommate called in late August. She was excited, chattering about the anniversary dinner, asking if I'd seen the venue photos Laura had posted, mentions the dress code. She caught herself mid-sentence. "Oh, I'm sorry. I figured you already knew everything. I didn't mean to get ahead of things." I told her she hadn't spoiled a thing. I got off the phone as gracefully as I could manage, and sat with what I'd just understood. 4 days later, Brian called. He had his sentences prepared. The event was intended to celebrate with their closest circle and his immediate family, his parents, his brother and sister-in-law, their mutual friends. The guest count had required difficult choices. They didn't want the evening to feel overextended. He hoped I could understand this was about the logistics of the evening, nothing more. I let him finish every sentence. Then I said the only thing that would end the call cleanly. "Of course, I understand. Have a wonderful time." He thanked me and hung up. What I felt wasn't grief. I'd spent 2 years after Joan died in real grief, and I knew what it felt like. A physical weight, unpredictable, arriving in waves. This was different. This was the quiet that settles when something you've been half aware of for years stops being a suspicion. 2 nights later, Laura came to the farmhouse to pick up some of her mother's things. Photo albums she'd been asking about. A garnet necklace Joan had specifically set aside for her. She let herself in with her key while I was outside in the barrel room, finishing some late work. When I came back through the side door, she was in the kitchen on the phone. I stopped just inside the doorway. Old house, thin walls. I'd lived here long enough to know where sound carried. "Brian, I know," she was saying, "but Dad he'd stand out. Carl and Wanda would notice immediately, and then it becomes this whole thing where everyone's explaining everyone." A pause, his voice faint on the other end. Then, "It's a different world. You know it is. The flannel shirts, the truck, showing up talking about his farm like I just don't want to spend the whole dinner managing it." I stood without moving. Through the window I could see the east block of the vineyard in the last light. 3 acres of Norton and Viognier I'd planted myself. "We'll deal with the property situation after," she said. "One thing at a time." I went back outside. I stood in the vineyard a long time. The explaining it and the property situation settled into my chest with the cold precision of things that have finally been said out loud. I knew Harmons at the Ridge because I'd been supplying them for 4 years. Denise Okafor, their wine director, had reached out after tasting my Reserve Viognier at a regional competition in Staunton in 2020. She'd emailed directly, asked if I'd consider a long-term supply relationship, and we'd shaken hands on a contract that had since been renewed twice. They poured 3 Crestwood Hollow wines on their permanent list and ordered additional cases for private events. I drove out there twice a year to review service and visit with the kitchen team. It was a professional relationship built on 4 years of reliable product and a genuine respect for what they were doing. I pulled up their private dining page that same evening. An anniversary event for 60-plus guests would fall under their signature celebration package: 4 courses, curated open bar, local wine list assembled by Denise from 3 Virginia producers. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I reached for the phone. Denise answered on the second ring. I explained the situation without excess detail. My daughter's anniversary party was booked at her venue. I hadn't been invited. I owned one of the 3 wineries currently on her pour list for the evening. I was straightforward about why I was calling. She was quiet while I finished. Then she said, "You want to be there in a professional capacity." "As a winery partner, it's a legitimate reason. I can't interfere with a private event." "I'm not asking you to. I just want to be in the room." A pause. "We do a service walkthrough for private events on the evening of. You're always welcome to observe when your product is being served. 7 o'clock. I'll be there." I spent the week that followed doing exactly what I always did. Rose at 6, walked the rows, checked on the barrels, returned calls from my distributor, who was pushing to expand our retail placement into Northern Virginia. Ate dinner, read, went to bed. Normal from the outside. On the inside, I was thinking about 11 years. About the 40 acres I'd bought with Joan's life insurance money, and the last of my retirement savings in the spring of 2013, 2.5 years before she got sick, on the theory that I needed a project larger than I could finish quickly. About learning soil chemistry from books at the age of 53. About the first harvest, which was embarrassing, and the second, which was better, and the 4th year, when the vineyard turned a profit for the first time, and I sat in this same office and allowed myself to feel something close to pride. About the contracts, the distributor, the restaurant accounts, the assessed value that had climbed to $1.9 million on land I'd bought for $340,000. Laura knew I'd gotten into farming. She'd never asked what farming meant. Saturday arrived the way October Saturdays do in the Shenandoah Valley, overcast and still and beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with sunshine. I dressed with care, not in flannel, not in work clothes. A charcoal sport coat I'd bought for a distributor meeting 2 years prior, a press button-down, clean shoes, the version of me that existed in contracts and invoices and poor schedules. I drove myself. 40 miles on Route 250, a road I'd traveled more times than I could count. I parked in the staff lot at Denise's instruction and walked in through the kitchen entrance at 6:45. She met me near the service station in the private dining room, professional and unhurried. The room was being laid for 80, round tables with white linen, crystal stems, small cream-colored menu cards in gold script. My son-in-law had decided I was too embarrassing to sit at a table in a room like this. On the service credenza, 3 bottles of Crestwood Hollow Reserve Viognier and 2 of the Norton, my label. The label my daughter had sketched for me on a kitchen napkin 12 years ago. A stand of trees above a gentle hollow, simple lines, The kind of drawing a 22-year-old makes in 5 minutes that ends up representing something larger than she intended. Reserve white for the first 2 courses, Denise said, going over the pour schedule with me. Norton with the beef. Looks right, I said. We finished the walkthrough. Denise moved on to other preparations. I stood near the credenza with the label in front of me, and the room filling up around me, and waited. My son-in-law saw me before my daughter did. He came through the entrance first, Carl and Wanda a step behind, all of them in formal dress, Brian already reading the room with the satisfied assessment of a man who has paid for an experience and expects it to deliver. His gaze moved across the tables, and the floral arrangements, and the candlelight, and landed on me standing next to the wine station, with a professional calm I'd been practicing since Tuesday. He stopped walking. Carl walked into him from behind. I nodded once, the way I'd nod to a supplier contact at an industry dinner, and turned back to the credenza as if I had something to review there. 20 seconds later, he was beside me. What are you doing here? Flat and controlled, the voice he used when he was furious and managing it. Checking on the service setup. I gestured toward the bottles. Crestwood Hollow's on the pour list. We like to confirm placement for larger private events. You work here. I supply here, going on 4 years. I turned to face him. Have been since 2020. He stared at me. I watched him process the bottles, the label, the corkscrew in my breast pocket, Denise walking past behind him with a collegial nod in my direction. I watched him set that against the flannel shirts and the old truck, and every version of me he'd decided was beneath the evening he'd planned. What is Crestwood Hollow? He said. My winery. The silence lasted long enough that Carl and Wanda caught up to us. Wanda was already extending her hand with a hostess smile before she'd registered anything. Hello, are you with the venue? He's with the vineyard, Brian said. He's Laura's father. Wanda's smile recalibrated. Carl received the summary from his wife in 2 quiet sentences and looked at me with the expression of a man who has just understood that he's walked into something that was already in progress. Laura appeared at Brian's side. She'd been looking for him across the room. She saw his face first, then mine, then the bottles on the credenza behind me. She went through the sequence very quickly. Then she saw the label. She stood completely still, looking at the little drawing she'd made on a napkin in my kitchen 12 years ago, the hollow in the hills, the stand of trees, her own 22-year-old handwriting in the logo she'd sketched in 5 minutes on a Saturday afternoon. Dad. Her voice came out different than I expected. Quieter. How long? 11 years. And this place? 4 years. We're on their permanent list. I paused. 2 Richmond restaurants as well, a regional distributor. About 300 cases through retail last year. She looked at me the way she'd looked at things as a child, when she was recalibrating what she'd thought she understood. The pearl earrings she wore had been her mother's. You never told me, she said. You never asked about the farm. Brian said, low and precisely, this doesn't change anything about the decisions we made regarding the guest list. That was about the evening's dynamic, not about Brian. Just his name from my daughter, in a voice I'd never heard her use with him. He stopped. She looked at me for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she said, will you stay for dinner? I wasn't invited. I'm inviting you now. Brian said nothing. Carl and Wanda said nothing. I looked at my daughter in her mother's earrings and understood that whatever happened next would matter for a long time. All right, I said. A member of the venue staff directed me to a table near the window, where 3 of Laura's college friends were seated. They were warm and genuinely curious, and asked me questions about the vineyard for the better part of half an hour before the first course arrived. A server poured my reserve Viognier into crystal stems at each place, and the room filled with conversation and the soft sound of an evening that had cost a great deal of money and planning and one deliberate exclusion. Brian sat at the head table across the room, with his parents arranged close, and his back angled slightly away from the direction I was sitting, which was a habit so ingrained in him I doubted he noticed it anymore. Laura came to my table between the salad course and the main. She didn't sit in an empty chair. She crouched down next to mine the way she'd always done since she was small, getting to eye level before she said anything that mattered. I should have invited you, she said. Yes. I was ashamed. She said it like it took something from her to say, of how Brian's family looks at where we come from. Our house, the way things were, everything before. And I handled that by making you smaller instead of standing up. She stopped. That was wrong. I held my wine glass by the stem and let her finish. You've been running a real business for 11 years, and I had no idea. She looked toward the credenza, the label. I thought it was a hobby, something to do after Mom. It was, at first. I heard me say things. She met my eyes steadily. At your house, last week. You were outside and I was on the phone with Brian, and I thought. She stopped again. I know you heard me. I didn't confirm it. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm genuinely sorry. I looked at her for a long moment. At the earrings. At the particular way she held her shoulders when she was being honest. Something she'd gotten from her mother. One thing at a time, I said. It's your anniversary. Go enjoy it. She stood and put her hand on my shoulder and held it there for a second before she went back to her table. I watched her sit down beside Brian and lean in to speak to him quietly. His face moved through several adjustments. Then he reached for his wine glass, my wine, in the crystal his money had paid for, in the venue his money had rented, and drank from it without speaking. We talked on the phone the Sunday after the party. She called without a specific reason, just to talk, and we stayed in for 40 minutes. The Sunday after that, she drove out to the vineyard for the first time in 4 years. I walked her through the rows in the late afternoon, the Blue Ridge going amber in the October light, and explained things I'd never been asked to explain, the varietals, the soil composition, the distribution chain, the economics of a small operation that had taken 11 years to look like what it looked like now. Mom would have loved it out here, she said, standing at the edge of the east block, looking west. She would have pushed me to do it sooner. Laura laughed. It was the laugh she'd had before she learned to perform a different one for different rooms, something younger and less managed. Whether her marriage weathers what it's been under is not something I can predict or control. That's between the two of them and none of my business. What I know is that my daughter and I have talked every Sunday since October, that she's asked real questions and listened to the real answers, that something was broken and something else is, slowly and carefully, being repaired. I didn't engineer any of this as a lesson. I built a vineyard because I needed somewhere to put my grief in my hands, and I had 40 acres and a dead wife's life insurance money, and nothing particular to lose. I learned soil science at 53, and pruning at 54, and distribution logistics at 56, and what I was doing, I understand now, was becoming the version of myself that existed after Joan. Quieter, more patient, less interested in being seen by people who weren't looking anyway. When my son-in-law decided I wasn't worth a seat at my own daughter's anniversary dinner, he was making a judgment about the man with the old truck and the flannel shirts and the farm he'd never bothered to understand. That judgment was entirely his to make. What he didn't know, and what I never needed him to know, was that I'd already built something worth more than his opinion of it, and that it was waiting for him in the venue he'd chosen, in the bottles on the credenza, in a label his wife had drawn for me when she still knew who her father was. You can spend a lifetime explaining yourself to people who've already decided what you are. Or you can put your hands in the ground and grow something and trust that the truth will find its own occasion to be seen. I've tried it both ways. The second way is better.